Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are excited to be joined together again with a returning guest, Dr. Domenic D'Ettore, to discuss the medieval debate centered around the use of analogy and demonstration. And in particular, we will be looking at two post-Cajetanian solutions or proposed solutions to the problems of medieval analogy, specifically in the thought of Francis Silvestri of Ferrara, or Ferrariensis, and Chrysostom Javelli. Dr. D'Ettore received his Doctorate of Philosophy from the Center of Thomistic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. His research focuses on the thought of the great 13th century philosopher Thomas Aquinas and on the reception and development of this philosopher's thought in the following centuries. He has served teaching at the University of St. Thomas in the Department of Philosophy and the Center for Thomistic Studies since fall of 2023, and he's written several articles and books on the subject of analogy, including Analogy After Aquinas, Logical Problems, Thomistic Answers. Dr. D'Ettore, thank you so much for joining with us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for having me again.
Yeah, of
Thank you.
course. I'm very glad to have you back on the podcast to discuss these post Cajetan figures, because we recently had on Domenic Lamantia to discuss post Cajetan controversies with respect to analogy in the Jesuit traditions with respect to objective precision and nominalism. And I figured we'd have you on to discuss an episode where we discuss these Dominican thinkers that are contemporaneous but come after Cajetan, because while I myself am I'm personally fond of Cajetan's solution to these issues. I think Lamantia raised a good point that it actually might prove more than Cajetan would have intended. So I wanted to look at these other figures as well. Were you at that conference Lamantia presented at, or?
Uh, the one in Rome?
Yeah.
Yes, yes, I was there and I got to speak to Dominic. I can't promise to be as entertaining as Dominic.
Oh no, yeah,
Man,
it was a very good presentation. It definitely blew me away when I first heard it. But yeah, with regards to these two figures, I figured we could start with Ferrariensis or Francis Silvestri of Ferrara. What can you tell us about Ferrariensis? What are some of his main noteworthy contributions?
okay. Well, in dealing with Ferrariensis, we're dealing with someone who lived from roughly 1474 to 1528. So he didn't live particularly long. He joined the Dominicans when he was about 14 years old and became eventually a master general of the Dominican order. For the last 3 years of his life, in fact, he was the master general of the Dominican order. Up to that point in his life, he was active mainly in northern Italy, but also uh, as part of his role in the Dominican reform movement was visiting convents in various other countries of Europe in his role as the master general. So you could say, in addition to being very involved in theology itself and the theological and philosophical controversies active in his day, he was also, as an administrator, very involved in, I guess, what we could call the Catholic Reformation, the Reformation that was going on in the church at the time. So you could say, in addition to his massive work, his commentary on St. Thomas's Summa Contra Gentiles, he had some other works of commentary on particular works of Aristotle. Those have not been as well studied to the best of my knowledge. And he also was one of the figures that wrote direct responses to positions of Luther on the Catholic side, I guess you could say, of the Reformation.
Very interesting. Okay, and if I may ask, what exactly was Ferrariensis's relationship with Cajetan like? Did they ever share a correspondence? Do we see any clear-cut examples of Cajetan influencing Ferrariensis's thought or positions?
Well, we know for sure that they read each other's work, or at least some of each other's work. It's not surprising. I mean, they were Dominicans who were set in northern Italy. A fair bit of overlap. That's natural there. He's only several years younger than Cajetan, and Cajetan ran up very early in his life the ranks of administration in the Dominican order. So he would have been responsible in part for the appointments that Francis Silvestri received, again, even from relatively early in his life, up to when he as one of Cajetan's successors. I think, in fact, he might have even been his immediate successor as head of the Dominican order, but I'd want to verify that. I'm sure that if you were talking to someone who was a expert in the archives of the Dominican order, someone like Michael Tavusi, then he could be able to tell you all about correspondence between Cajetan and Ferrariensis, such as there was. What we mainly know for sure about their correspondence, at least as related to the issues that we're interested in, is that Ferrariensis asked Cajetan specific questions about Cajetan's position on analogy. And so he thought that Cajetan said one thing in Cajetan's commentary on the De Ente Essentia, and something contrary to that in Cajetan's work called On Analogy of Names.
Mm.
And I believe it's around the year 1509, I'd have to double check that Cajetan wrote a response directly addressed to Francis Silvestri that is called under the title of De Conceptu Entis, or On the Concept of Being, in which he tries to show what he actually meant about the two questions that Ferrariensis had. So they were definitely in correspondence with each other. Ferrariensis cites Cajetan in various places. In his main treatment of analogy, Ferrariensis throws in there the line, and for other problems that I've not treated here, see the most excellent work of the ingenious Cajetan on the topic.
Right. So he's very clearly has familiarized himself with Cajetan's work, and at least in those instances, is deferential towards him. Okay, interesting. And I figured maybe we could talk maybe about how Ferrariensis approaches these questions of univocity, analogy, and equivocation. I figured maybe we could start first why Ferrariensis thinks univocity can't apply to attributions made with respect to God and creatures, and then maybe we could try to discuss how he thinks analogy works in demonstration without leading to problems of equivocation. So starting with the first, why exactly does Ferrariensis think that Scotus' position is as untenable? Why does he think that univocity can't apply with respect to attributions we make of with respect to God?
Okay. Now, the approach that Ferrariensis takes, at least in the texts that I'm familiar with by him, which is the main thing that people cite when they're working with Ferrariensis on these problems, is he just goes through Aquinas' arguments. So if you look at Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 1, Chapter 32, you see Aquinas just run through several arguments for why names cannot be predicated univocally about God and creatures. And Ferrariensis just goes through each one, expressing what it is he thinks needs to be added to, if anything needs to be added to those arguments, and addressing certain kinds of objections that might be raised against them. And something that really stands out to me in his treatment of it is he looks at Aquinas' argument that God is too simple, both in thing and even conceptually, for names to be predicated univocally about God and creatures. And for my part, when I first read that argument, I was very perplexed by it, because I thought, well, I understand the in thing part, that God's simplicity is such that what God has absolutely simply, and what we might say, I guess you could say unitively, other things have with some level of metaphysical complexity. And so if univocity involves, well, the two things have to have in some sense the same nature, or they have to be the same, at least generically in their natures. And God can't be even generically the same as other things because of the simplicity of the divine nature. And well, that's going to make sense that names can't be said univocally about God and creatures, unless you change the definition of univocity, which is, of course, what Scotus does. What was more difficult for me was the claim that God is too simple to be it's too simple conceptually for us to understand. Because I thought, well, wouldn't that be an objection to using analogy for naming God and creatures just as much as it's an objection to naming God and creatures univocally. And I was quite delighted when I read Ferrariensis' commentary that, well, this same problem that occurred to him. And he actually goes into some great detail trying to give an explanation for why it is the case that God is too conceptually simple for univocity, but not too conceptually simple for analogy.
Gotcha. Okay. So his concerns sort of follow Aquinas's trajectory that he gives in the Summa Contra Gentila, is that the concerns are with respect to univocity are they have to do with divine simplicity, not just in the world of nature or being independent of cognition, but how we think about God. It runs up against problems if the attributions are univocal. But then we have Ferrariensis coming in saying that this doesn't apply to analogical predications.
Yeah. So the basic idea is that in univocal predications, the univocal has to be simpler than the univocates conceptually. Okay, so if I'm saying something univocally about, say, two diverse species, well, the univocal has to be different than the difference. And so it's got to be the case where the difference is adding something to the univocal. And so if I'm predicating animal univocally of the human and the beaver, well, the difference between the human and the beaver has got to be something added on top of that. And so
right,
animal is simpler than beaver and simpler than human. Now, the claim with the analogates is that, well, they're not simple to begin with. So insofar as a name is said analogously, you're actually expressing immediately different natures.
Okay. Interesting. All right, then. Well, then maybe jumping to how he tries to answer problems with respect to analogy. I know in your book you talk how there's usually three types of questions that these figures try to answer: the rationis problem, the model problem, and the equivocation problem. With respect to Ferrariensis, how does he try to tackle the problem of ratio rationis? As I understand it, he has a threefold imposition of being and a threefold conceptual division that he lays out.
Yes, and he does this directly in the context of dealing with names said about God and creatures. And he's doing it in the context of his commentary on Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 1, Chapter 34, where Aquinas is putting forth that names are said of God and creatures by analogy. So, yes, he distinguishes between three impositions of a name, and then also, not the same section, but in the same commentary on the same chapter, talks about three different conceptions through which we are using these names. And so the three impositions refer to an order in which a speaker is signifying a name about something. And so if we go with his example in the text, the example of wisdom. So when you or I or whoever it is that's the first person that uses this word says that something is wise, that would be that first imposition of the name. And the first imposition of the name will be about a creature. Okay, so first and foremost, say, wisdom will be used in a sentence along the lines of, well, Socrates is wise. And so wisdom in that case signifies this perfection in a creature. And the second imposition of the name that he comes up with is, well, then we would say God is wise. I think now we actually have a different signification. We say God is wise. So we had imposition 1 for Socrates is wise, and imposition 2 for God is wise. Now he claims that at this particular point, it's not that we're dealing with analogy yet. We only deal with analogy once we get to the third imposition of the name. And that's what happens when we call Socrates wise by reference to God's wisdom. So in this third imposition of the name wisdom, wisdom means the creature's wisdom as derived or as imitating, in some sense, God's wisdom. And you can see why you would need the first two.
Right.
In order to get there. I mean, you have to have the notion of the creature's wisdom in the first place, because our knowledge begins with creatures. You'd have to have some sense of God's wisdom if you're going to then talk about the creature's wisdom by reference to God's wisdom. And so then you can get that third one where we talk about Socrates as being wise derivatively from God's wisdom. Now that's for Francis Silvestri, where a name is being used in an analogous way, only in that third sense. There's a couple of reasons why you can go in that direction. One is because in this is a case where you're actually saying it about many that don't agree in species or genus, which is where analogy is useful. I'm talking about more than one that don't agree with each other, either in species or genus, with respect to the name that you're trying to say. Don't need to worry about wisdom when I'm just talking about creatures and being analogous. I don't need to worry about the wisdom of God being analogous if I'm only talking about the wisdom of God. A second reason why it makes sense within his overall account to say that analogy is only happening at this third level is that he very strictly holds to the rule that names are only said analogously where the definition of the name as said of one is included in the definition of the name as said of the other. And so for there to be analogy, it's got to be that a primary analogate is in the definition of a secondary analogate. And it's only in that third imposition where the definition of one is appearing in the definition of the other. And in this case, it's the definition of God's wisdom appearing in the definition of human wisdom.
Okay. Does he ever explain why he thinks that relationship obtains where the definition of one is in the other, or does he just think it's on account of causality?
There are several passages where Aquinas says that.
Okay.
He says that in an analogy, the definition of one appears in the definition of the other. And this ends up becoming one of the points of contention between different interpreters of Aquinas, where some people will say, well, that only applies to certain kinds of analogy, say the healthy model analogy, but it doesn't apply to other kinds of analogy.
Okay.
And Francis Silvestri maintains, well, it applies to all kinds of analogy, and so that's effectively why, on his account, the healthy model of analogy has to be the controlling way of thinking about analogy, because it's the one in which it's obvious that the definition of one appears in the definition of the other.
Right. It's interesting that he opts for the healthy model then with respect to the question of the model problem, because so far the trajectory of the Dominican commentators seems to be opting for the analogy of proportionality and having problems with the healthy model. So it's interesting that he opts for the healthy model of the two.
Yes, and it seems like his reason for doing so is a combination of what he thinks is the preponderance of the texts of Aquinas, and then this rule that, again, he does find in the text of Aquinas. And, obvious applies in the case of these healthy models. It's not so obvious that it applies in what I called in the book the principal models, or analogy of proper proportionality. He says that it does. He will say that this also applies in these analogies of proportionality, but he doesn't give you any examples. It's probably what I find most dissatisfying in his commentary on that passage. Is he makes this particular claim that I don't know what to make of, and he doesn't give me some examples or some explanation. It seems to be, well, this is the principle, so it's got to apply.
Yeah.
And leaving it, I either think it's really obvious, and so I don't need to explain, or I'm leaving it to you to figure out how to work that out.
Gotcha. Okay.
I haven't figured out how to work that out.
Gotcha. All right. And then there's also so we've discussed the three fold impositions of creatures absolutely inadequately, God absolutely and inadequately, and then creaturely perfection insofar as it's ordered with respect to divine perfection. But what about the division of concepts that he has? That's also another tool in his toolbox that he uses.
It is. And so he'll say that we've got one concept, say, of wisdom that applies to the creatures and applies exclusively to the creatures. So say absolutely of the creatures. Another concept of wisdom that applies absolutely to God, but it's thinking of God proportionally to creatures. Right? It's still an inadequate concept of God, but it is only applying to God. When you're using this concept to think about wisdom, you are not thinking about creatures, except insofar as creatures are providing you the basis for thinking of God as something proportional to what you've encountered in the creatures.
Okay.
If you were to say a creature is wise, applying this concept, you would be saying something false. Just to try to explain the idea in another way.
Okay.
Then the third concept of wisdom is a concept that applies inadequately both to God and to creatures, but it's trying to signify them insofar as they are proportionally similar. When he's talking about this third concept, he's starting actually to sound an awful lot like Cajetanian.
Right.
That we're thinking of them insofar as they are proportionally alike.
Okay.
Now, it is striking that his three concepts don't line up exactly with his three impositions. First two concepts seem to line up really nicely with the first two impositions. But the third concept isn't thinking of creatures as derivative from God. It's thinking of God and creatures insofar as they're proportionally similar.
Mm.
That would be one of those things that if I ever get to sit down with Ferrariensis, what I like to ask him about is you have these three impositions, and then you have these three concepts. Why did you do it exactly that way? It would have been nice if
Right.
it would have been nice if you had a fourth imposition and a fourth concept to make all these line up perfectly.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because I know another issue that has just been in the background is whether or not there's a separate concept or not with respect to our concepts of being or simple perfections. Because
Right.
whereas Flandrensis and Cajetan are going to say no, there's not. I think Sonctinus is the only one to say there is a separate formal concept of being. Where exactly does Ferrariensis fall on this debate?
It seems like he's sympathetic in both directions. The expression that he uses to talk about the one that he favors is that it's truer. So he'll take the position that what Cajetan and those others who have said that there is not a separate formal concept say that their position is truer than the alternative position that there is this separate formal concept. So you could say, on the one hand, he's inclined towards saying that my concept that applies to, say, inadequately, both to God and to creatures, that somehow it's different from the concept of God or the concept of the creatures. So different from, say, the first two concepts.
Hmm.
But he doesn't really want to say that it's altogether separate. And then as he proceeds on, he seems to be, in the text, seems to be going even more firmly into the position that this truer position is indeed the true position. And so it ends up reading an awful lot like, or at least could be at least inclined to read it as an awful lot like what Cajetan told him in De Conceptu Entis, which is that what you have is you take these two concepts that are analogous to each other, and either one of them is the other concept by analogy.
Mm.
So
Okay.
the concept that is signifying creatures is also signifying God analogously, because God and creatures are analogous.
Okay. Yeah,
If I
that does.
actually had a concept of God that was just of God, then that would also signify the creatures insofar as the creatures are analogously
Okay.
like
Interesting.
God as well.
Okay, because that does sound very close to what Cajetan is getting at with his take concept to entities. And how exactly does Ferrariensis try to answer the problem of equivocation? Because from what I've read of him and your work, it sounds very close to what Cajetan thinks is the solution to this problem, but I could be wrong.
Well, he doesn't tell you. It's one of those problems that he decides not to take up in his commentary. And he's told you in his commentary that the problems that I don't take up see Cajetan's on analogy of names. So in my work on the topic, what I've tried to do is to show, okay, well, how could we use what Francis Silvestri does say to give an answer to the question that would meet the standards that Cajetan is employing in on analogy of names. Can we render these two consistent with each other? What Cajetan ends up saying to solve the problem, and what Ferrariensis says in his own name, and then has referred you to Cajetan
Right.
on it.
Okay.
And so it seemed to me that you could give an answer to the problem that was consistent with Ferrariensis's principles and met Cajetan's basic standards. So what does he think you need to do? So he takes Scotus' standard for how do you solve a problem. If you have enough unity in your terms, it would be a contradiction to affirm and deny them about the same thing. Then you got enough unity to actually go through your syllogism. And on Cajetan's account, well, proportional similarity is enough. And so if I can't affirm something of you and deny the same thing of you insofar as we're dealing with proportional similarity, or I can't affirm something about you and deny it about something else proportionally similar to you, precisely insofar as you and it are proportionally similar.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that does sound very close to what Cajetan does. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so that's what Cajetan says. And I think that if we use Ferrariensis' third concept, or thinking about God and creatures insofar as they are proportionally similar, that we can say, well, we're basically on track with what Cajetan says.
Okay.
That we're doing. So if I'm thinking, say, the standard argument that comes out of Cajetan and others, all simple perfections are present in God. Wisdom is a simple perfection. Therefore, wisdom is in God. Well, if I'm using the word wisdom, say in that minor premise, and I'm thinking of it through the concept, that third concept, insofar as it's proportionally similar to God and creatures, then I don't have any problem when I go into the conclusion and say, wisdom is in God. Because again, still using it in that same sense. So it would be a contradiction to say what is proportionally similar in God and creatures is must be in God, and to deny then that the same thing is in God, at least insofar as it's proportionally similar to creatures.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. All right. And then I figured we could move on to discussing Chrysostom Javelli and his position. He's a very interesting figure from what I hear tell about him. What can you tell us about Javelli and some of his main accomplishments?
Okay. Sorry for how much of a word salad I've been giving you before. When I talk about these things, I like to have charts and to be able to be
Sure.
pointing to things on a chart and listing it all out. It's a challenge to talk about these things orally without the visual aid. Okay, so Chrysostom Javelli. Well, it's not clear exactly how old he was. I was reading a very recent article on him by Michael Tabuzi, who, as far as I can tell, is the great scholar of the thought of Chrysostom Javelli, and points out that in different manuscripts, Javelli tells you how old he is, and they're dated at different times, and they don't agree with how old with what year it is he must have been born in. And so he was either born the same year as Francis Silvestri, or he was born 4 years earlier. In any case, he also joined the Dominican order as a teenager. He says that he joined when he was 14. Maybe he really joined when he was 18. He did his studies at Bologna, and actually, to use a more contemporary term, graduated as a Master of Theology at the same time as Francis Silvestri, seemingly like in the same unit together. So these are two people who could not have failed but to have known each other. Whereas Francis Silvestri seems to have been put on an administrative track, Chrysostom Javelli was sent off to be an inquisitor. And he doesn't seem to have been particularly enthusiastic about being an inquisitor. It seems like he conducted his role faithfully, but not with a great deal of zeal, shall we say. And there are records of his which he's complaining that it's getting in the way of his real work, which is the academic work that he wants to be doing. But he did, dutifully investigate people for Lutheranism, which is, of course, a major issue going on in his time and place. Certainly, there were Lutherans in northern Italy, which included the scope of his work as an inquisitor. And he was someone who was accused of having Lutheran tendencies. He's also one of the people that was consulted about the proposed divorce between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Now, I've not read someone saying that we actually have anymore what he wrote in response, but it does seem to be the case that he thought, yep, that divorce should be okay. Mm. So he did not take the position that eventually was taken by the Pope on that grave matter, as it was called at the time. So involved in the controversies, very much involved in the controversies of his day. Someone who primarily wanted to do his scholarly work, but then also had to do the day-to-day tasks of a regional inquisitor.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and yeah, I just find him a very interesting figure because where he treats the topic of analogy, if I'm not mistaken, it's not a commentary, it's a separate work on the transcendentals is what he's working on, and that's how analogy kind of gets in, or am I mistaken?
Oh, he has a separate work on the transcendentals. In fact, it's one of the only ones of its kind. If you were to read up on Jan Ertsen's massive volume on the history of the transcendentals, he actually cites Javelli's text as one of maybe 3 texts that was actually dedicated to talking about the transcendentals systematically. It's an interesting work. It basically starts off like Cajetan's commentary on Aquinas' being in essence. So a whole section on being as first known. And then from there goes on to talk about the different transcendentals and their relationship to each other and the relationship to being, and taking up certain kinds of controversies with Scotus, such as whether or not the first division of being is into finite or infinite being. You wouldn't be surprised to learn that Javelli thinks that's a matter on which Scotus is mistaken. But while it's relevant to his discussion of analogy, it's not actually the primary place where we find him giving an account of his overall theory of analogy. Where we see that is in his book of Questions on Aristotle's Physics, his Questions on Aristotle's Metaphysics, and then and especially in book 4.
Okay. Yeah, from what I understand, Javelli is a very interesting figure because whereas most Thomists will try to take on Scotus's objections by trying to argue for sort of an analogous concept, Javelli doesn't immediately do this. He's more interested in investigating into the issue of ens primum cognitum, or being as first cognized. What can you tell us about? We're hoping to get Brian Kempel on to discuss this issue in more detail, but what can you tell
Okay.
us about this issue very briefly, and then how exactly does why is Javelli concerned about it with respect to analogy?
Sure. Now, I'd have to talk to Brian Kempel about this more myself. I had some, at least the last time I read through his treatment of Cajetanian on this topic, I thought that it was very insightful in other parts, and I disagree with him in some others. And that's certainly when I write on the topic, I'm very pleased to be able to cite Brian's work on this issue. So I do think that Javelli is taking his lead from Cajetan's work on being in essence. So if you look at Cajetan's work, he first addresses the question of being as first known. And then from there, he proceeds to talk about analogy. Now, I think this is very important because he is directly responding to Scotus. And Scotus's arguments for why being has to be univocal are built off of Scotus's understanding of being as first known. And one of the things that I found in my own looking into this is that Cajetan seems to be relatively unique, at least up to his time, at making this connection. Now, I think that many of the earlier figures who address Scotus's arguments fail to address them on his own grounds, and in fact end up talking past Scotus because they don't address being as first known. And so if you accept Scotus's position on being as first known, you're going to end up in a position similar to the one that he has, whether you use the term univocity or some other term to describe it. And Cajetan was a close enough reader to notice this. So Javelli has that in the background to model from. So he also takes up the question of being as first known. He wrote that treatise on the transcendentals prior to writing this other work on, or his grander work on a book of questions on metaphysics. And you certainly see some building off there. So a key claim of Javelli about being as first known is that it is, to use the Latin expression, cui debitur esse, with confusion. Or so we could say, that to which being is owed. And so you've got this confused concept of that to which being is owed. Now, Javelli maintains that the being as it is first conceived in this way, where being as it is conceived absolutely, isn't yet said about more than one thing. So since it's not yet said about more than one thing, it's not univocal, it's not equivocal, and it's not analogous. And so this seems to me to be a unique contribution of Javelli to the discussion. I haven't seen this anywhere else, at least not anywhere else prior to him. But he's definitely onto something here. At least when we're thinking about analogy or equivocity or univocity in the traditional way, we should be recognizing when we're talking about a common predicate. Mm-hmm. A predicate is only common when it's being said about more than one thing.
Right.
So when I've abstracted from its being said of more than one thing, and it seems like it will lack a characteristic that can only arise from being said about more than one thing. So we have this idea that being in the first place, or being as absolutely considered, is neither univocal nor equivocal nor analogous. And then it's going to become so once we start applying it to more than one thing and then comparing how it applies to the different things. And so on Javelli's account, first of all, we've got this confused concept of being. From there, we move on to a confused concept of substance. From there, we move on to a confused concept of one or more of the accidents. And from there, we can actually work back to a distinct concept of substance and move on to a distinct concept of the different accidents. And once we're doing that, now we're in the realm of analogy. where we can see that this initially confused concept applies in an analogous way to substance and to the accidents, or to God and to creatures, and also applies in an analogous way across the more distinct concepts. So being as said distinctly of substance is analogous to being as said distinctly of quantity, and so on and so forth.
Right, right. Yeah, it's very interesting how he argues for this concept of being that is indifferent to univocity, analogy, and equivocity. And if I'm not mistaken, he actually employs a lot of the arguments that Scotus uses to prove a univocal concept, but he just doesn't call it univocal. He actually, I think he uses the certain and doubtful argument to prove, we can
That's
know
right.
that there is a being without knowing whether it's a substance or accident. And then he uses that to prove there's this issue of ens primum cognitum. If I may
That's
ask,
right.
though, with respect to this issue, does with Javelli's understanding of ens primum cognitum, is it only applicable with respect to natural being in the world, or would it also apply to ens rationis, or cognition dependent being? Because I feel like I could easily make an argument. Plato and Aristotle both think animality is a being, but they might be confused about whether it's a natural being or a cognition dependent being, or something along those lines. Does he go into that issue, or not at all?
Well, he does go into the issue of whether or not this concept of being applies only to created beings, or if it also applies to God. And he explicitly takes the position that being, as it serves as the subject of metaphysics, includes the division of finite and infinite being, God and creatures, all acts, all potency. And so he rejects the notion that God only falls into the subject of metaphysics as a principle of metaphysics, which is a position that is held by many of the other Thomists.
Right.
And so it's one of his most radical positions as compared to other Thomists of his day. He discusses this position at length, arguing against the position held by Domenic of Flanders. And so if you were to look up, say, the position of a great recently passed away contemporary figure, John Whipple,
right,
you'd see him defending a position very similar to Domenic of Flanders, and arguing against a position like Javelli's. Now, what I don't find him saying, and that it also would include being as being of reason. Now, that's something that I would want to do some more work on. Having said that, if we are thinking of being as that to which being is owned, or that to which esse is owed, and we're taking esse with confusion, it does raise the question, well, how much confusion are we taking it with? How little have we distinguished it from other things? And if we haven't made any distinctions at all, then should we also be including within this notion being of reason? Now, if you're just using some variation of Scotus's argument from a certain and doubtful concept, I don't think you would end up including being of reason. And the whole point, the whole force really of the certain and doubtful argument is based off of, well, I know about this thing that it is a being. Meaning, I know it's a real being.
Okay.
But I don't know what sort of real being it is. And so I've got this sort of univocal concept of real being. And Scotus himself doesn't think that beings of reason fall under his univocal concept of being.
Okay.
And Javelli says that his position agrees with, in fact, he says his position agrees with everybody important. And that includes Averroes, it includes Scotus, it includes Thomas Aquinas, that includes Cajetanian. He thinks everybody agrees with his overall position, but it's questionable whether or not everybody agrees with his overall position. He certainly seems to be thinking that on this matter, that the disagreement between Thomas Aquinas and Scotus is merely verbal difference.
Right.
Which again is something that sets him apart from many of the other figures.
Right.
There are other Scotists who take a similar position. And
Okay.
so someone like Maestrius, I think, holds a position very similar to Javelli's. But Maestrius is a Scotist, of course, and Javelli is Javelli a Thomist.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so with respect to Javelli's sort of solution to the rationis problem, he does hold that there is this univocal concept of being that's only divided and distinguished from within.
You don't want to call it univocal, though. It's not univocal yet.
Right, it's not univocal. Okay, right. Univocity and analogy and equivocation occur afterwards. Is that correct?
Right.
Or okay.
Yeah. So say it applies univocally to things that are the same generically or the same specifically. And it will apply analogously where you've got the less than generic unity between the things. So some kind of unity, but not one that is founded on any kind of common nature.
Okay, interesting. So it would only occur after we have. I'm trying to think though how that solution avoids problems with respect to equivocation. Does he address any issues with respect to equivocation, or is that not his concern?
He does. So he thinks that, for example, using a strict healthy model of analogy isn't going to work because what the name signifies about the different analogates is actually something quite different, such that it couldn't establish a contradiction. So like he says, there's no contradiction between saying an animal is healthy and medicine is not healthy if you're using healthy about medicine in the same sense as it applies to the animal. And so you're not going to be able to make reasoned arguments from the attributes of the health of an animal to attributes about medicine insofar as medicine is healthy.
Okay.
But he says that in the case of this other kind of analogy, the kind of analogy that is going to work, that what is, there actually is something, the ratio of the name is actually signifying something that is present in the analogates, although it's present in them unequally. So he has a notion that analogates in this fuller sense, analogous in the sense it's relevant for metaphysics, that they share in the same intelligible character. You could say that in a broad sense, they share in the same nature, although not in a strict sense, share in the same nature, but they share in it unequally. And okay. So God and creatures are beings. They really are beings, but they're beings unequally. Substance and accidents are beings, but they're beings unequally. And he adds as an important note that one of them depends upon the other in some sense for being what it is with respect to the analogous term that you're using. So creatures really are only beings because of God. Accidents are only able to be beings because of substances. And so he thinks that this order of dependency is a basis for saying that there's inequality between them, but that the kind of dependency means that the things in question really have the attribute, although, yeah, they have it unequally, analogously to one another. And so they don't have it in the same way as they would if they were generically the same or specifically the same.
Right.
But there's this kind of real causal order between them. When I read Javelli, I am more and more inclined to think that he's a source for something like Suarez's position, that you can distinguish between analogy of extrinsic attribution versus analogy of intrinsic attribution, where Javelli is treating healthy model as extrinsic attribution, and then this other kind of analogy as intrinsic attribution, but he doesn't give you any examples other than being or these other transcendental terms. Whereas then Suarez is going to come along and say, well, effectively, they're both healthy model, except that we can distinguish between cases where it's just extrinsic attribution. There really isn't anything in the secondary analogate that is the same as what's in the primary analogate. Like there's nothing in the medicine that is the same as what's in the animal with respect to the healthiness. Whereas there is something the same in the substance as in, and the accidents is in the substance and in creatures as in God, which will allow that intrinsic attribution. But I don't find it to be sufficiently fleshed out in Javelli to understand exactly what it is that would justify saying, okay, well, I've got intrinsic attribution here and I've got only extrinsic attribution over there, or the kind of analogy that should work beyond the examples that he gives.
Mm-hmm.
But this is an overall problem that I have with thinking about analogy of intrinsic attribution, is just a lack of examples.
Right.
They just give you the examples of what it is you're trying to prove. Okay, that's going to work for substance and accidents, or it's going to work for God and creatures. By not saying, and the reason why it works is because it works in all these other cases.
Right.
That are more obviously, I guess you could say, working for what's more obvious to us.
Right. So Javelli does reject the healthy model, so to speak, but does he explicitly endorse the other model or proportionality, or?
No, it's conspicuous by its absence from his presentation of the topic.
Huh.
And really, it does stand out. I mean, he's argued against the position of Domenic of Flanders, who will use that approach. Not the only approach that he uses, but he does explicitly use it. He's clearly familiar with the writings of Cajetan, but he doesn't bring it up. It's just, it's very striking mission. Can't have been by accident.
Right.
Now, the extent that he's using a set of models, he's going from the threefold model of analogy from Commentary on the Sentences, Book 1, Distinction 19, Question 5, Article 2, Reply to the First Objection. I did have to write all that down. I don't remember all of those.
I was going to say, that's really right. Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's the exact same division that Cajetan relies on when he's giving his analogy of names, or he tries to read it. Yeah.
It is, but then what Cajetan does is he, into the third of those divisions, he reads that as proportionality.
Right. Which Javelli doesn't do.
Javelli doesn't do.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, Javelli is following Sonsinus on this very closely. It's almost word for word the same as what you find in Javelli when you read, it's what you find in Sonsinus when you read Javelli's treatment of the passage.
Okay.
And Sonsinus also does not make the connection to proportionality.
So I understand one of the claims that Javelli made. I understand that one of the claims Javelli makes is he thinks that Aquinas and Scotus are in agreement when it comes to the issue of the equivocation problem. Why exactly does Javelli think that? Like how exactly does he try to tackle the equivocation problem?
So effectively, he thinks that what Scotus is calling univocity is what Aquinas is calling analogy, for the kind of terms that are names that are said that can be said analogously of God and creatures, for the kind of analogy that can work in a syllogism.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, there's one way in which that's not that revolutionary of a claim. I mean, Cajetan says that if you actually were to strictly apply Scotus's conditions for univocity, you'd have univocity wherever it is you have sufficient unity for founding a contradiction. And then in some kinds of analogy, you have sufficient unity for founding a contradiction.
Right.
So if you've got this, then you've got what Scotus is counting as univocity.
Okay.
So that would be at least one way of saying that, if I'm going to take Scotus at his word, this is what I mean when I say univocity. Sufficient unity for establishing a contradiction and mediating a syllogism. And really what it takes to be able to mediate a syllogism is having that sufficient unity for founding a contradiction. If I can say that I've got this and what I've got is analogy, then I've got a kind of analogy that by Scotus's terms would be univocity.
Okay.
Something else that's also important to keep in mind here is a distinction that Javelli makes in the text between real univocity and merely logical univocity. And he is at pains to make the point that in the case of these terms that are said about God and creatures, you would not get that real univocity. Now, he also doesn't, if I'm remembering the text rightly, I'm having a moment of forgetfulness over here. I don't think that he thinks that it gets the logical univocity either. But Scotus doesn't think that there is real univocity for names of God and creatures either. He seems to be thinking that it's only a kind of logical univocity. Now, this becomes a disputed question among the Scotists, with some Scotists saying, no, it actually is real univocity, and other Scotists saying, no, absolutely, it's not real univocity, it's this merely logical kind of univocity, and then they make additional kind of clarifications on that. So there's some basis for him to try to maintain that there's not real disagreement over there. Now, there is real disagreement with Scotus over being as first known and other matters pertaining to our formation of concepts and the order of our formation of concepts. So it's not like that there isn't any real disagreement to be found in the surrounding issues. But he at least has some basis for trying to make the claim that we are dealing with at least at some level, a merely terminological difference.
Interesting.
I mean, it definitely is the case that what Scotus means by univocity is not what Thomas Aquinas meant by univocity.
Right. That was something that you also pointed out in your book, is that there do seem to be like changing definitions of what univocity and analogy are when you get to like Capriolis or Ferrariensis or whatever. And there is a good deal of, unfortunately, talking past one another because of that.
Yeah.
All right, interesting. I think what's so fascinating about Javelli is that he thinks that there is a connection with respect to ens primum cognitum and these issues with respect to Scotus and Aquinas on analogy. But you said that was anticipated by Cajetan in one of his works. Okay,
that's right. If you look at Cajetan's work called his commentary on being in essence, it's fairly clearly set up that way, where he has this whole discussion at the beginning of ens primum cognitum that goes well beyond anything that Thomas says in the text, is heavily engaged with the terminology that had been developed by the likes of Henry of Ghent and by John Duns Scotus, and then is engaged in polemics with the Scotist position, and that sets up his account of the being as the subject of metaphysics, and then also his account of being as said analogously, whether of God and creatures or across the categories.
Okay, interesting.
And Javelli's work on the transcendentals, the first part of it is basically a synopsis of that first chapter of Cajetan's work on being in essence. Goes through the same distinctions, gives you basically an abbreviated version of the polemics against the Scotists that Cajetan had given. Gives you a different answer to the question of what being as first known is. But then he uses what he came up with to come up with actually a fairly different account than of how to solve that rationis problem.
Right. All right. Well, maybe then this has been a very good interview, Dr. D'Ettore. Thank you so much. If I can maybe ask some concluding questions. Out of the figures that we've discussed, Cajetan, Ferrariensis, Javelli, which of them would you say become the most influential in later scholastic debates regarding analogy? Of course, when it comes to Cajetan and Ferrariensis, their commentaries are going to be circulating with the famous Leonine editions of the Summa and the Summa contra Gentiles. But with respect to scholasticism, do we see these later figures being taken up in discussion as well, or?
Well, you might actually be more engaged in the later scholastics than I am. So maybe you would have a better sense of that even than I do with the focus of your research. I mean, obviously, Cajetan is a figure that continues to be influential throughout the scholastic period and into the 20th century, and perhaps becoming more influential again. I don't find Ferrariensis being as influential in figures that I have come across. He does get, say, cited occasionally by Suarez and the like, but I don't know that he is as influential as Cajetan, but I'll defer to others on that topic. Javelli is an interesting one because some of his positions became very unpopular among the Dominicans, and that led to his work not being as widely read. So, like his theory on free will or predestination and so forth. Banez didn't like it. Molina liked it. Actually, some of Javelli's works were actually put on a list of you're not allowed to read this works among Dominicans. But that being said, it's pretty clear that Suarez was a close reader of Javelli. And so if there were no other source than the influence that Javelli had on Suarez, Javelli was very influential on these very topics that we're engaged with. And at least at this particular point in my research on the topic, and I've got a lot more to do, I see Javelli as a figure that anticipates what Suarez does on this topic.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Thank you. And do you have maybe any closing recommendations for those who'd want to learn more? I mean, obviously, we've talked about your book before this episode, Analogy After Aquinas, Logical Problems, Thomistic Answers. But is there anything new in the works that has just come out from scholars in your field, or?
Let's see. Well, there's a new book on Chrysostom Javelli. It just came out in 2023. So that's Chrysostom Javelli, Pagan Philosophy and Christian Thought in the Renaissance. So it's a work that I'm excited to be able to look into and do more. Got to read the initial biographical essay in there, but I haven't gotten to and much further than that. I know that Gyula Klima is working on a book that's going to be called, or at least provisionally, After Form, and that will be taking up some of these topics that we've been engaged with, and I'm really excited to see what he does with that topic. Thinking of him as in some way, or continuing the project of these earlier figures where they are wrestling with these problems, but wrestling with these problems in dialogue with whatever is the other leading philosophical schools that they're able to be engaging with. If you haven't read Klubertans's book, St. Thomas Aquinas on Analogy, that's always a good source to go through for seeing what are exactly the debates, what are the problems. Just this great background material, even if you end up disagreeing with Klubertans's own solutions to the problems. And I'm certainly continuing to work on these issues. Got something coming out on Francis Silvestri of Ferrara's commentary on the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 1, chapters 32 to 34. And I'm also working on something that should be coming out in the next couple of years. Depends on how fast publishers are, on comparing Cajetan and Javelli on being as first known.
Oh, cool. So, okay.
See what comes of that.
Nice. And I'll be sure also to link in the description Dr. Kempel's monograph on Ens Primum Cognitum.
Yeah, please do.
All right. Dr. D'Ettore, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
All right. Thank you very much, Hunter. I appreciate it.